Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to tackle something we hear like all the time, liberalism, but you know, might not totally get like all the nuances, right?
Right.
So you sent over this excerpt from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on liberalism, and honestly, I think it's about to like seriously challenge some assumptions I've got.
Yeah. It's amazing how one word can pack in so many different ideas, even like internal debates within the word.
Totally. So before we like totally jump in, can we lay some groundwork? Like what's that one thing that like all these different kinds of liberals, what do they all agree on?
Well, I'd say at the very core, liberalism, like, it's all about this question of how do you justify political authority,
Okay,
but also, like, at the same time, how important individual liberty is.
gotcha.
So it's not just about saying, okay, we have to accept power because it's there. It's more like, hold on, if we're going to limit freedom, we need good reasons.
Okay, so even if, like, different liberals, they disagree on the details, they all say liberty. That's the foundation.
Exactly. That's the bedrock.
The bedrock, yeah.
And I think a great way to see this is to go way back in time.
Okay.
Like, think 1215, the Magna Carta.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah, that document that basically told the king, hey, you're not above the law, man.
Yeah, but how does, like, a medieval document connect to, like, modern liberalism?
Well, the Magna Carta, you're right, it wasn't like we are liberals, but it started some key ideas. Like, it said even the most powerful person, the king, has to follow the law. And also that people have rights that can't just be taken away, just 'cause.
Right.
And there were even specific clauses like the idea of due process or not being thrown in jail for no reason, which, like, that's limiting power to protect the individual.
Oh, okay, so even back then, they were, like, planting these seeds of, like, okay, we need to limit power and make sure people have rights. And that kind of led to all this modern liberal stuff.
Yeah, exactly. But now here's where it gets super interesting. We keep talking about liberty, but, like, does he even know what that means?
Huh,
Like, is there one definition of liberty that everyone agrees on?
right.
Not really, and that's a big debate even within liberalism, because turns out even something that sounds simple, liberty, it can be understood in so many ways.
Okay, well, now I got to know, like, break it down. What are the different ways to think about liberty?
So one big one is called negative liberty. Basically, you're free if no one's actively messing with you, like stopping you from doing what you want to do. It's about freedom from things like coercion.
So if no one's, like, stopping me from traveling or taking a job I want, that's negative liberty.
Exactly. And there's this famous philosopher, Isaiah Berlin. He said, negative liberty is the area where a man can act and no one's obstructing him.
Okay, I get it, but I'm guessing there's, like, more to the story.
For sure. There's also positive liberty. And this goes further than just saying, well, no one's stopping me. It's more about freedom to do things, like freedom to reach your full potential. You're not just free from things, but free to become who you want to be.
So it's not just what others are doing, but do you even have the power, the resources to make choices?
Exactly. And this is where thinkers like T.H. Green come in.
Okay.
He said positive liberty is all about autonomy. Like, can you actually act based on what you value on your goals, or are you being held back by things you can't control, like lack of education, poverty, even just like your own bad impulses?
Oh, wow. So even if no one's literally blocking me, if I'm, like, limited by not having enough money, enough chances, I'm not fully free in that positive way.
Exactly. And there's another way to see freedom. It's called Republican liberty. This one focuses on freedom from domination.
Okay, now we're getting, like, super nuanced. How's domination different from just someone interfering with me?
It's about this idea that someone else, they could have this power over you, even if they're not using it right now, like you're dependent on them. They could mess with your life if they wanted to.
So even if right now no one's stopping me from doing something, but, like, someone could step in, that limits my freedom in this Republican sense.
Exactly. It's about potential interference, someone else having that power to just decide for you, even if they're not doing it right this second.
Wow. Okay, so we've got negative, positive, and Republican liberty.
Exactly.
My mind is, like, officially blown. I didn't realize how much depth there is to just the idea of being free.
It's a lot more complex than people think, right? And it brings up a huge question for all of us. Like, which kind of liberty speaks to you the most? Which one matters most in your life, in the world?
That's a great question for our listeners to think about. And this brings us to, like, another layer of, whoa, didn't see that coming. The Stanford thing mentioned this big split between classical liberalism and then, like, new liberalism.
Right.
What's that all about?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. Like classical versus new liberalism. It's like a major dividing line.
Yeah.
And a lot of it comes down to like how each side sees private property
Okay.
and markets, in a free society.
Okay, hit me with the classical liberal take on all that.
So for classical liberals, liberty and private property, they're like totally connected.
Okay.
They'd say the right to own things, control your work, your money, and just be in the market, that's essential for freedom, period.
So it's all about, like, government, back off, let the invisible hand do its thing. People should make their own choices about money and all that.
Yeah, that's a big part of it.
Okay.
We got to be careful here, right? Classical liberalism, it wasn't just about like, yay, capitalism, everyone for themselves.
Right.
A lot of these classical liberals, they really cared about progress, making things better for everyone, like the working class, women, groups that were getting a raw deal.
Okay, so it wasn't just about protecting the rich and powerful.
No, not at all. Think about John Stuart Mill. He's a huge figure in classical liberalism.
Yeah.
He thought a free market with, limited government would actually lead to more prosperity, more opportunities for everybody in the long run.
Hmm.
He saw it as a system that could, like, lift society up, even though it wasn't perfect.
That's a more, I don't know, thoughtful side of classical liberalism than I think a lot of people realize.
For sure. But okay, now what about this new liberalism? Where did they break away from this?
Yeah, tell me.
So this new liberalism, it kind of pops up late 1800s, early 1900s.
Okay.
And basically, people were starting to wonder, is the free market really enough? Does it always deliver on its promises? They felt like maybe government needed to be more involved, fix inequality, make things fairer.
So what changed? Like, was this just intellectuals having new ideas? Or did stuff happen in the real world that made people doubt the free market?
It was kind of both. On the ideal side, you have thinkers like T.H. Green. He's the guy who was big on positive liberty, remember?
Right, right.
He said, just getting rid of stuff that's stopping you, that's not enough for real freedom. He thought poverty, bad education, all these social problems, they can trap people just as much as a government telling you what to do.
So the focus shifted from, like, just negative liberty, no one's interfering, to this idea of, can people actually thrive, reach their potential? Maybe government needs to help with that.
Yeah, that's it. And this shift in thinking, it happened alongside some like major events that made people rethink what government was for.
Right.
Like the Great Depression, that was huge. It showed that even a strong free market can totally crash. And then what? Millions of people are in poverty.
Yeah, that's a powerful example of how, like, even if the government's not directly the problem, economic hardship, that's a massive limit on freedom.
Exactly. And as people kind of lost faith in the free market just working itself out, they started to see government, maybe it could actually be a good guy.
Okay.
Plus, democracy was on the rise, the idea that people should have a say, that government should be for them.
Right.
So instead of seeing government as like the enemy of freedom, people started thinking maybe it can open up opportunities, make things fairer, especially for those who the free market isn't helping.
So they were less about government, stay out of my life, and more about, hey, government, maybe you could fix some of this mess.
Totally. And this is where you get social justice liberalism coming into the picture.
Okay.
This is the idea that government should like actually redistribute wealth,
Okay.
create safety nets, have regulations to even things out.
So while the classical liberals were focused on smaller government protecting negative liberty, these new liberals, they're like, government needs to step up, promote positive liberty, make sure everyone has a real chance to succeed.
That's a great summary. And this leads us to a really important figure, John Rawls.
Oh yeah, John Rawls. His book, A Theory of Justice, like, that's a big one.
Huge.
I gotta admit, it's always seemed kind of dense to me.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely philosophical.
But it's clearly had a massive impact. Can you, like, give me the explain it to my grandma version?
So at the heart of it, Rawls is all about fairness.
Okay.
He asks this really cool question. Imagine we're designing a society from scratch, but we don't know what our place in it will be.
Right.
Like, will we be rich, poor, healthy, sick, talented, not talented? We don't know. What kind of rules would we agree to then for a fair society?
That's a really interesting thought experiment. It forces you to think, like, not just about what's good for me, but what's fair for everyone, even if I end up in a bad spot.
Exactly. And Rawls says from this original position where we don't know our own place in the game,
Right.
we'd pick rules that make sure everyone has a decent life, even the people who end up the worst off.
Okay.
And this leads to his famous difference principle,
Okay.
which basically says inequality is only okay if it helps the least advantaged people.
So it's not enough for the rich to get richer. They got to be lifting up the poorest folks, too.
Exactly. It's not just about creating wealth. It's about distributing it in a way that benefits everyone, especially those at the bottom.
Okay.
And Rawls connects this to the idea of reciprocity. Like, we're all in this together. We agree to a system where, yeah, there might be differences, but those differences ought to work for everyone, not just some people.
I could see how that, like, social contract idea, where we all agree to a system that's fair for everyone, has really resonated with a lot of liberals. It's a powerful vision.
Totally. But, not everyone is totally on board with Rawls.
Yeah, I was going to say, I bet there were some folks who weren't too happy with these
Oh,
ideas.
yeah, there were critics, and one of the biggest was Robert Nozick.
Okay.
He was a libertarian philosopher, much more of a classic liberal view, big on individual rights, small government.
Ah, so we're back at that core tension in liberalism, like how much equality versus how much individual freedom.
Right.
How did Nozick challenge Rawls?
So Nozick said Rawls is focused too much on the outcome, like who ends up with how much wealth.
Okay.
He's not paying enough attention to the process, how people actually get those things.
Okay.
Nozick's argument was anytime you try to force a specific way of distributing stuff, you're going to mess with people's rights. You're going to have to constantly interfere with their lives.
So Nozick was like, it's not just about who has what, it's about how they got it. Did they earn it fairly? Did they inherit it? Was there some shady business going on?
Exactly. He said, as long as people get their stuff in a just way, without stealing, cheating, or forcing anyone, they have a right to keep it, even if it makes things unequal.
Okay.
And to illustrate this, he had this famous thought experience, the Wilt Chamberlain argument.
Okay, now I got to hear this. Tell me that Will Chamberlain.
So Nozick says, imagine a society that's perfectly just. Everyone has equal wealth, whatever your definition of just is.
Okay.
Now, along comes Wilt Chamberlain. He's a basketball superstar. Everyone wants to see him play.
Right. Wilt distilled.
People are happy to pay a little extra to watch his games, right?
Yeah.
And over time, Wilt gets super rich just because millions of people freely chose to give him their money.
So even in a perfectly equal society, individual choices, like the free market, can lead to inequality. And Nozick's saying there's nothing wrong with that as long as it happened through free choices, not because someone was taking advantage of others.
Exactly. His point is, if you try to keep redistributing wealth to make things equal all the time, like Rawls' principle might suggest,
Right.
you're going to need the government constantly stepping in, telling people what to do with their money. And Nozick saw that as like a slippery slope to tyranny, sacrificing freedom to force a certain outcome.
Yeah, that's a strong argument. It shows how tricky it is to balance, like, wanting a just society, but also respecting individual choices.
Right, it's tough. So who's right here, Rawls or Nozick? Is there a clear winner in this equality versus liberty battle?
Yeah, is there?
Well, that's the thing. There are always easy answers, right? These different perspectives, they're part of this ongoing conversation within liberalism,
Okay.
this constant back and forth about what a just society really mean. And even within each side, there's room for nuance, for ideas to change.
Okay, tell me about how these ideas have developed. Where's the conversation going now?
So a lot of modern egalitarian liberals, the folks who are concerned with equality,
Yeah.
they've kind of moved away from this idea of making everything perfectly equal all the time
Okay.
because of critiques like Nozick's.
Right.
Now, they focus more on making sure the process is fair, that everyone has a real chance to develop their skills, contribute, and have a decent life.
So it's less about everyone ending up with the same amount of stuff.
Right.
And more about making sure everyone has a fair shot at success, no matter where they started.
That's it. It's about fixing those deep inequalities that hold people back.
Yeah.
Making sure things like education, healthcare, economic opportunities, they're not determined by your race, your gender, how much money your family has.
It's about creating a level playing field, not forcing everyone to end up at the same finish line.
Exactly. You got it.
This is making me realize, like, liberalism, it's way more dynamic, way more complicated than I ever thought. It's not just like a set of rules. It's a living conversation, different values bumping up against each other, all trying to figure out how to make a more just and free world.
For sure.
But I have a question. Is liberalism just about politics, about government? Or is it like a bigger thing? Does it tell us something about like ethics, values, how we should live our lives?
That's a really great question. It kind of gets to the heart of like, what is liberalism? Is it just a bunch of rules about how we, run a country? Or is it like something bigger? Does it say something about, how to live a good life, what we should value, all that stuff?
Okay, yeah, I'm totally curious now. So is it just about politics, or is it something more like comprehensive was the word they used in the Stanford thing?
That's the debate, right? Some people say liberalism, it is, or at least it can be, a comprehensive doctrine. Like it covers not just politics, but like ethics, philosophy, ideas about, what it means to flourish as a person, moral responsibility, even what a good society looks like.
So it's not just about setting up a system, with checks and balances, individual rights.
Right.
It's also about how we should treat each other, even in our personal lives. What's a good life, all that.
Exactly. And there are these different like strands within liberalism that give different answers to these questions.
Okay.
Like one is called Millian perfectionism.
Okay.
Drawing on John Stuart Mill, he said the good life is all about like developing yourself, flourishing as an individual,
Okay.
being free to cultivate your talents, find your own path, do stuff that matters to you, that brings you fulfillment.
So for Mill, It wasn't just about protecting people from like a bad government.
Right.
It was about creating a society where people could actually like become the best versions of themselves.
Exactly. And that idea of like individual flourishing, it's been huge in liberal thought. Then there's contractualism, which says morality. It comes from agreements we make with each other.
Okay.
Agreements that respect our autonomy, our right to make our own choices.
So instead of saying like morality comes from God or from tradition,
Right.
it's more about like we decide together what's right and wrong based on respecting each other as individuals who can make their own decisions.
Exactly. And that fits in really well with liberal ideas of choice, consent, self-governance. You see this in everything from contracts, like legal agreements, to the emphasis on democracy, people choosing their leaders. Then there's pluralism, which is all about accepting that there are lots of different values, different ways of living.
Okay, so liberalism isn't saying there's only one right way to live, one set of values everyone has to follow. It's more like, hey, as long as you're not hurting anyone, you do you.
Yeah, that's the core of it. Pluralism says in a free society, people are going to have different ideas about what's good, different religions, different moral frameworks.
Right.
And that's not a bad thing. It's something to embrace, right?
It's like a marketplace of ideas as long as everyone's playing fair, respecting each other's freedom.
Yeah, I like that. And then finally, there's subjectivism, which says ultimately values come from what individuals desire, what they prefer.
Okay, but isn't that kind of like a slippery slope? Because if everyone gets to decide what's good or bad, doesn't that lead to, like, total chaos? How can we agree on anything if it's all just personal preference?
That's the tough question, right? How do you balance individual freedom with the need for some shared values, some sense of the common good, some way to say what's right and wrong? It's about finding that balance between, like, do whatever you want and forcing everyone to follow the same strict moral code.
Right, right. This reminds me of that tension we talked about earlier, like the individual versus the collective. Does liberalism always put the individual first? Or is there room for, like, community, shared values, recognizing that we're all connected?
That's a crucial point. Like the classic liberal view, especially someone like Mill, he saw society as basically a bunch of individuals,
Okay.
each with their own rights, and those got to be protected. But even Mill knew individual freedom isn't absolute. There are limits, especially if what you're doing harms other people or takes away their freedom.
So it's not just a free-for-all where anyone can do whatever they want. Consequences be damned.
Right, exactly. There's got to be some way to balance individual freedom with, what's good for everyone.
Yeah, with the well-being of society as a whole.
Exactly. And there's been a ton of debate within liberalism about how to do that, how to find that balance. And then you have the thinkers who are called communitarians or organicists. They say this focus on just the individual, it misses something important. It ignores the fact that we're all part of these bigger things. Families, communities, cultures, nations.
Right. It's not like we're just floating around making decisions in a vacuum.
Exactly. They'd say, look, our identities, our values, they're shaped by these groups we belong to.
Right.
And we have obligations to these groups too.
That makes sense. But doesn't that, like, open the door to maybe suppressing individual differences or forcing people to conform to some narrow idea of what's good for the community?
Yeah, that's the worry, right? And that's why this debate within liberalism has been all about finding that sweet spot. How do we respect individual autonomy while also recognizing that we need a sense of community, of belongings, of shared purpose? Like modern liberals, they try to acknowledge both sides of that. They
Right.
say, yeah, social ties matter, your culture matters, even those obligations you didn't choose but that are part of your life, they matter too.
So it's not like individual good versus community good. It's about recognizing that both are important.
Exactly. It's about seeing that individuals, they're both shaped by their social context, and they're capable of making their own choices, finding their own path, defining what a good life means to them. And that kind of brings us to another big question. How far does liberalism reach? Is this a universal ideal? Like, does it apply to all people, all societies? Can you have a decent society that's not liberal?
Ooh, those are some deep questions. So is liberalism like a one-size-fits-all solution? Or are there situations where it just doesn't work?
It's tricky, right? And liberals have been arguing about this for a long time. Like, think about John Stuart Mill again. He said liberalism didn't apply to what he called barbarians.
Okay.
He thought societies needed to reach a certain level of, like, development, of being able to govern themselves rationally before they were ready for liberal ideas.
I could see how that could be, like, pretty problematic, even if we try to understand him in his historical context.
Right.
Like saying some soldiers just aren't capable of freedom, which seems kind of contradictory to, like, the whole point of liberalism.
Yeah, you got to be careful with that kind of thinking. And while we can try to see Mill's view through the lens of his time, when colonialism was a big thing and there are all these assumptions about Europe being superior,
Right.
his take on barbarians does point to this ongoing tension within liberalism. How do you say, human rights are universal, everyone deserves freedom. And at the same time, respect the fact that there are different cultures, different political systems.
So is liberalism ultimately about everyone being the same? Like a cosmopolitan ideal where everyone has the same rights and freedoms no matter where they come from? Or is it more about letting different societies do their own thing, even if it's not liberal in the way we understand it?
That's the big debate. Even if you say, okay, liberal principles are universal, everyone deserves free speech, freedom of religion, all that,
Yeah.
there's still the question of how do you deal with groups that aren't liberal, both in the world and within your own society?
Okay, let's break that down. What kind of non-liberal groups are we talking about here? And what makes it tough for liberalism to interact with them?
We could be talking about like authoritarian governments that crush dissent or religious communities whose beliefs clash with, typical liberal values. The challenge for liberalism is figuring out how do you live alongside these groups peacefully and still stick to your principles? Like, do you try to spread liberalism to other countries, even through military force? Do you tolerate illiberal practices within your own society in the name of diversity? Those are tough calls.
Yeah, it's like constantly walking this tightrope between sticking to your principles,
Right.
but also recognizing that different cultures might have different ideas about what freedom means, what justice means, what a good life means.
You got it. It's delicate, and there are no easy answers. Like, take Mill again. He was mostly against interfering with other countries, even if they weren't liberal.
Hmm.
He believed in this, like, global live and let live approach.
Okay.
He thought societies would eventually figure out freedom and progress on their own.
So even though he had strong opinions about, what a good society looked like, he wasn't into forcing those views on others.
Exactly. But there was a catch. He said sometimes intervention is justified. Like, if there are massive human rights violations,
Okay.
well, or a minority group is being persecuted. It's a tough line to draw, and it gets even harder when you think about non-liberal groups within liberal societies.
Right, that's what I was getting at before. How does liberalism deal with the clash between individual rights and groups that have beliefs that aren't liberal? What about religious groups that are against same-sex marriage, or they want their kids to be exempt from certain school stuff because of their faith? How do you handle those situations?
That's like one of the biggest challenges for liberalism today in the 21st century. We're living in a world that's super diverse, lots of different values and beliefs bumping up against each other.
Yeah,
Liberalism has this long history of trying to accommodate religious groups because freedom of conscience, that's a fundamental right.
right.
But obviously there are limits. You can't just allow any practice, even if it's harmful, just because someone says it's their religion.
Of course not.
And finding that line where tolerance ends and harm begins, that's really, really hard. Like, think about that famous court case in the U.S., Wisconsin v. Yoder. The Supreme Court said Amish parents, they could take their kids out of school at 14, even though it was against the law.
Right, they said more schooling would go against their beliefs, their way of life.
Exactly. And the court, they knew education was important,
Right.
but in the end, they sided with the parents' right to religious freedom.
But wasn't there a worry that those kids would, miss out on opportunities, not be exposed to the wider world?
That's the tension, right? That case is a classic example of the kind of dilemmas liberalism always faces, balancing competing values, trying to make a society where different groups can live together peacefully while also respecting individual rights and preventing harm. It's a lot to juggle.
It's a tall order, and it seems like it's only going to get tougher as societies get more diverse and more interconnected. So is liberalism, up to the challenge?
That's the question we're all trying to figure out. Liberalism isn't like a magic wand. It's not a set of perfect answers.
Yeah.
It's more like a framework for thinking about these challenges, for having those tough conversations, for finding compromises, for figuring out how to look together, even when we disagree. It's messy, it's imperfect, and it's always evolving.
So instead of thinking of liberalism as a destination, a finished product,
Right.
it's more like a journey, a process of constantly learning, questioning, adapting to new situations.
Exactly. It's an invitation to keep wrestling with these big questions. What does it mean to be free? How do we balance individual rights with the common good? How do we create a just society when there's so much diversity and disagreement?
This deep dive has been amazing. I feel like I have a much better understanding of what liberalism is, all the different ideas and debates within it.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
So any final thoughts for our listeners?
I'd say, remember, liberalism isn't just some abstract theory. It's not just a political label you throw around.
Yeah.
It's a set of values, principles, practices that shape our world, and it's something we all have a stake in, whether we realize it or not.
Hmm. That's a good point.
So stay curious, keep asking those tough questions, and don't give up on the work of building a more just and free world. Even though it's messy, it's challenging, it's also super important.
I love that. I think that's the perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into liberalism.
It was my pleasure.